April 6, 2003, Baghdad, Iraq. 4:30 hours. Chief Warrant Officer Dan Holloway pulled collective, lifting his AH-64D Apache longbow off the desert floor into darkness so complete that without night vision goggles, flying would be suicide. Beside him, his co-pilot gunner scanned instruments, calling out altitude and airspeed as they accelerated toward a city that aviation doctrine said helicopters should never enter. Baghdad sprawled ahead. 7 million people, thousands of buildings, countless places where an enemy could hide with a shoulder-fired missile. Every rooftop was a potential firing position. Every street a canyon where helicopters couldn't maneuver. Every window concealed threats that radar couldn't detect. Attack helicopters were designed for open terrain, deserts where they could stand off at distance, rolling in to fire precision weapons, then breaking away before enemies could react. Urban combat violated every principle of rotary-wing warfare. Flying between buildings meant restricted maneuver space. Low altitude meant increased vulnerability to small arms fire. Dense civilian populations meant every shot risked collateral damage. Yet here they were, preparing to fly Apache and Kiowa helicopters directly into Baghdad's streets at altitudes measured in feet, not hundreds of feet. Not because doctrine permitted it, but because American soldiers on the ground were dying and needed help that only attack helicopters could provide. The mathematics were brutal. Republican Guard units, Fedayeen fighters, and foreign jihadists had transformed Baghdad into a fortress. Every intersection was defended. Every bridge was an ambush site. Iraqi forces had studied American tactics from the Gulf War and knew that helicopters were vulnerable. Shoot enough RPGs and AK-47s at low-flying aircraft, and eventually you'd bring one down. What the Iraqis didn't fully understand was American determination to adapt. When initial tactics failed, Army aviators would invent new ones. When doctrine said don't fly in cities, pilots would develop urban combat techniques through trial and error, paying tuition in bullet holes and near-death experiences. This is the story of how attack helicopter pilots transformed themselves from standoff weapons platforms into urban close air support, flying missions that seemed suicidal to accomplish objectives that couldn't be achieved any other way. Of how Apache and Kiowa crews developed tactics for fighting in three-dimensional urban terrain where threats came from every direction. This is the story of rotary-wing aviation's most dangerous mission, becoming the 911 force for troops fighting house to house in a city that wanted to kill anything that flew. Army attack helicopter doctrine in 2003 was built on lessons from Desert Storm and decades of Cold War planning against Soviet armor. The AH-64 Apache was designed as a tank killer, a platform that could hover behind terrain, pop up to acquire targets with sophisticated sensors, fire Hellfire missiles from several kilometers away, then drop back into defilade before enemy forces could respond. The concept was standoff precision fires, kill the enemy from distances where they couldn't effectively shoot back. This doctrine worked brilliantly in open terrain. During Desert Storm, Apaches destroyed hundreds of Iraqi tanks and armored vehicles, operating from positions where return fire was minimal. They'd find Iraqi positions, mark them with lasers, launch missiles, and watch through FLIR, forward-looking infrared, as tanks exploded kilometers away. But urban terrain destroyed these advantages. You couldn't stand off at distance when buildings blocked line of sight. You couldn't hover behind terrain when there was no terrain, just concrete, steel, and glass. You couldn't fire from maximum range when the enemy was mixed with civilians in structures that contained schools, hospitals, and homes. The OH-58D Kiowa Warrior, smaller and more agile than the Apache, carried lighter weapons, 50 caliber machine guns, 2.75-inch rockets, and Hellfire missiles. Kiowas were reconnaissance and security helicopters designed to scout ahead, identify targets, and either engage with their own weapons or guide Apaches onto objectives. Kiowa pilots developed a technique called air-to-air reconnaissance, flying low and slow to visually identify targets that sensors might miss. It was dangerous but effective, especially when distinguishing military vehicles from civilian ones or identifying enemy positions in complex terrain. Neither aircraft was optimized for urban combat. Both had been designed for different missions, but when the invasion of Iraq reached Baghdad, doctrine and design met reality, and reality won. The first major engagement for attack helicopters in Iraq came on March 23, 2003, near Karbala, an operation that became infamous as a cautionary tale about helicopter vulnerability. Apache Company, 1st Battalion, 227th Aviation Regiment, received orders to conduct a deep attack against Iraqi Republican Guard positions south of Baghdad. 33 Apaches would fly nearly 200 miles, destroy armor and artillery threatening ground forces, then return to refuel and rearm. The plan looked good on paper. Intelligence suggested Iraqi air defenses in the sector were minimal, weather was acceptable, navigation wouldn't be problematic with GPS and night vision systems. What intelligence missed was that Iraqi forces had learned from Desert Storm. They knew American helicopters were devastating against armor in open desert but vulnerable to mass small arms fire at low altitude. So, they prepared an ambush. As the Apache formation entered the target area near Karbala, every Iraqi unit in the sector opened fire simultaneously. Thousands of soldiers with AK-47s, machine guns, and RPGs fired into the air, creating a wall of lead and explosives that no aircraft could avoid. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. Every Apache in the formation took hits. Windscreens shattered, hydraulic lines severed, engines sustained damage. Flight controls were compromised. Chief Warrant Officers Dave Williams and Ron Young, flying the Trail Apache, took devastating fire. Their aircraft was hit by small arms, RPGs, and possibly a shoulder-fired missile. Systems failed progressively until the helicopter was no longer flyable. They executed a controlled crash in Iraqi-held territory and were immediately captured. The remaining Apaches, all damaged to varying degrees, fought their way out of the kill zone and limped back to friendly territory. One aircraft returned with over 20 bullet holes. Another had lost hydraulics and barely made it back. Every single Apache required significant repairs before it could fly again. The Karbala Gap engagement taught painful lessons. Lesson 1. Iraqi forces, though outmatched technologically, could create kill zones where massed fires overwhelmed individual aircraft survivability. Lesson 2. Deep attacks without adequate intelligence on enemy dispositions were suicidal. The Apaches had flown into an ambush because intelligence hadn't identified the concentration of Iraqi forces. Lesson 3. Helicopters needed better coordination with ground forces. The isolation of the Apache attack meant no artillery could suppress enemy positions, no ground units could provide flank security, and no rescue forces were positioned to extract downed crews quickly. These lessons would prove critical when helicopters began operating over Baghdad. Urban terrain, like the Karbala engagement, meant flying at low altitude through areas where enemies could engage from multiple positions. The difference was that in cities there was no option to stand off at distance. You either flew into the concrete canyons or you couldn't support ground troops at all. As American ground forces fought their way into Baghdad in early April 2003, attack helicopter crews recognized they needed entirely new tactics. Traditional approaches, flying at altitude, using standoff weapons, maintaining distance from threats, didn't work when supporting troops fighting house to house. Soldiers needed immediate, precise fires on targets, sometimes only meters away. That meant helicopters had to get low, get close, and get dangerous. Lieutenant Colonel Steve Townsend, commanding 3rd Battalion, 8th Cavalry Regiment, which included attack helicopter companies, worked with his pilots to develop urban combat techniques. The first innovation was flying lower than doctrine recommended, sometimes at 50 feet or less, threading between buildings to reach positions where pilots could observe enemy forces and engage with direct fire weapons. Flying this low violated basic helicopter safety principles. At 50 feet, if anything goes wrong, engine failure, tail rotor damage, loss of control, you have maybe 2 seconds before impact. There's no time to auto-rotate, no altitude to troubleshoot, no options except crash. But low altitude had advantages in cities. It reduced exposure to small arms fire from ground level. You were visible for only seconds before buildings blocked line of sight. It allowed visual identification of targets that sensors might miss, and it put 30mm cannons and rocket pods into effective range for precision engagement. The second innovation was using building corners and intersections as battle positions, hovering spots where helicopters could stabilize, observe sectors, and engage targets before repositioning. This adapted the Cold War concept of terrain masking to urban environments using buildings instead of hills for protection. A helicopter would approach an intersection at low level, pause briefly at the corner to scan for threats, then either engage targets or continue moving before enemy forces could acquire and fire. The key was never staying static. Constant movement made targeting difficult for enemies using unguided weapons. The third innovation was team tactics adapted for urban terrain. Apache-Kiowa hunter-killer teams, which had worked well in open desert, needed modification for cities. In urban operations, Kiowas would fly high, relatively speaking maybe 200 feet, to provide overwatch and spot targets. Apaches would fly low, using the Kiowa's guidance to position for attacks. The Kiowa crew could see threats the Apache crew couldn't. Someone preparing an RPG on a rooftop, fighters moving between buildings, vehicles vehicles positioning for ambush. This vertical separation also created crossfire opportunities. If an enemy engaged the low-flying Apache, the Kiowa could suppress or destroy the threat from a different angle. If someone shot at the Kiowa, the Apache could engage from below. These tactics evolved through combat experience, not training manuals. Pilots would try approaches, survive, or learn from near misses, then refine techniques for the next mission. Every engagement taught lessons, though some lessons were written in bullet holes and battle damage. Understanding urban helicopter combat requires understanding the aircraft and their weapon systems. The AH-64D Apache Longbow. The Apache was a formidable weapons platform, a 30mm M230 chain gun with 1,200 rounds of high-explosive ammunition, mounted in a turret that could engage targets independently of aircraft orientation. Hydra 70 2.75-inch rockets in pods holding 19 rockets each, useful for area suppression or precision strikes with laser guidance. AGM-114, Hellfire missiles, laser-guided weapons designed to destroy tanks, but equally effective against buildings, vehicles, or hardened positions. The Longbow radar system, mounted above the rotor hub, could detect vehicles and prioritize targets autonomously. In open terrain, this was revolutionary. The Apache could identify enemy armor without exposing itself visually. But in cities, the Longbow's effectiveness diminished. Radar couldn't distinguish between civilian and military vehicles. It couldn't identify dismounted infantry. Buildings created radar clutter that made target identification difficult. Instead, urban operations relied on the TADS PNVS system, target acquisition and designation system, Chan-Chen-Chuai's pilot night vision system. The TADS, operated by the front seat pilot, who was actually the gunner, provided magnified day TV, FLIR thermal imaging, and laser designation. The CPG, co-pilot gunner, could identify targets visually, track them through thermal imaging, and engage with precision. The Apache's survivability came from redundant systems. Dual engines meant single-engine failure wasn't necessarily catastrophic. Armored cockpits could withstand small arms fire up to 23mm. Self-sealing fuel tanks prevented catastrophic fires from bullet holes, but this protection had limits. RPGs could destroy an Apache. A lucky AK-47 round through certain areas, tail rotor gearbox, main rotor head, critical hydraulic lines, could bring the helicopter down. And at low altitude in urban terrain, there was minimal altitude for emergency procedures. The OH-58D Kiowa Warrior. The Kiowa was smaller, more agile, and more vulnerable than the Apache. It lacked armor protection, carried lighter weapons, and had only one engine. If that engine failed, you were going down immediately. But the Kiowa's size and agility made it ideal for urban reconnaissance. It could maneuver between buildings more easily than the larger Apache. It could land in small spaces if necessary, and its smaller size made it a harder target. The Kiowa's primary sensor was the MMS, mass-mounted sight, a stabilized ball mounted above the rotor that contained thermal imaging, TV camera, and laser rangefinder-designator. This allowed the Kiowa to observe while remaining partially masked behind buildings or terrain, with only the masts and sensors exposed. Kiowa armament was lighter but still effective, a 50 caliber machine gun, excellent for engaging personnel and light vehicles, 2.75-inch rockets for suppression or precision strikes, and Hellfire missiles for destroying vehicles or structures. Kiowa pilots developed a reputation for aggressive flying and willingness to take risks. They had to. Their mission required getting close to enemies, identifying targets visually, and operating in the most dangerous positions. The joke was that Kiowa pilots were the crazy ones, the cowboys who'd fly anywhere and try anything. In urban combat, both aircraft types were essential. Apaches provided heavy firepower and sensor capabilities. Kiowas provided agility and visual reconnaissance. Together, they created hunter-killer teams that could navigate urban terrain, identify threats, and deliver precise fires in support of ground forces. April 5th and 7th, 2003, the 2nd Brigade Combat Team, 3rd Infantry Division, conducted thunder runs into Baghdad, armored columns driving directly into the city to demonstrate American capability to operate in Iraq's capital. These weren't reconnaissance missions. They were deliberate shows of force. M1 Abrams tanks and M2 Bradley fighting vehicles driving through Baghdad's streets, engaging any enemy forces encountered, proving that American ground forces could penetrate the city's defenses. The thunder runs faced intense resistance. Iraqi forces engaged from buildings, launched RPGs from alleys, and positioned vehicles for ambush at key intersections. The armored columns fought through sustained combat, taking casualties but accomplishing their objective of reaching Baghdad's center. Attack helicopters provided critical support for both thunder runs, but the missions required tactics that had never been attempted at this scale. Chief Warrant Officer 3, Sean Doak, flying an Apache with 127th Aviation, described the experience. We were flying between buildings, below roofline level sometimes. I could see people in windows. They could definitely see us. It was like being in a shooting gallery where you're the target. The helicopter's mission was to clear routes ahead of advancing ground columns, engage threats on flanks, and provide suppressive fire when armored vehicles encountered concentrated resistance. Flying these missions meant operating at altitudes between 50 and 200 feet, sometimes lower when terrain or buildings required it. Pilots navigated using visual references, street layouts, distinctive buildings, bridges over the Tigris River, because GPS accuracy wasn't sufficient for flying between structures. The threat environment was intense. Iraqi forces had learned from earlier engagements that helicopters were vulnerable to massed fires. They positioned fighters throughout buildings with instructions to fire at any aircraft, creating zones where hundreds of AK-47s, machine guns, and RPGs engaged simultaneously. During one engagement supporting the first Thunder Run, an Apache flown by Chief Warrant Officers Mike Francis and Ricardo Crocker took heavy fire while engaging enemy forces near a key intersection. RPGs exploded close enough to rock the aircraft. Small arms fire created a distinctive popping sound as rounds passed through the rotor disc. Francis maneuvered aggressively, using buildings for cover, while Crocker engaged targets with the 30mm cannon. They destroyed several vehicles and suppressed enemy positions, allowing the ground column to advance. But their Apache returned to base with multiple bullet holes. Rounds had penetrated the fuselage, damaged non-critical systems, and come dangerously close to hitting vital components. Every mission over Baghdad, you took fire, Francis recalled later. The question wasn't whether someone would shoot at you, but how many people and how accurate they'd be. The Kiowa warriors proved equally valuable in different roles. Their smaller size allowed them to fly reconnaissance ahead of Apaches, identifying threats and marking targets. When ground forces encountered resistance, Kiowas would orbit overhead, providing real-time intelligence about enemy movements and positions. Chief Warrant Officer 2, Paul Calhoun, flying a Kiowa during the April 7th Thunder Run, spent hours orbiting over Baghdad, spotting Iraqi forces and calling in either Apache strikes or requests for artillery fire. At one point, he identified a group of vehicles positioning for ambush and engaged with his .50 caliber gun, destroying the lead vehicle and causing the others to scatter. The .50 cal might not sound like much compared to an Apache's 30mm, but when you're putting precision fire onto a specific target, a truck, a mortar position, individuals with RPGs, it's incredibly effective, Calhoun explained. The Thunder Run succeeded partly because helicopter support prevented Iraqi forces from massing against the armored columns. Every time enemy fighters tried to organize a defense, attack helicopters would identify and destroy them before they could effectively engage American ground forces. The most intense urban helicopter combat came on April 7th when Task Force 164 Armor, 2nd Brigade Combat Team, conducted what became known as the Deepest Thunder Run, not just entering Baghdad but seizing and holding objectives in the city's heart, including Saddam Hussein's presidential palaces. This wasn't a raid, it was occupation. American forces would drive into central Baghdad and stay, establishing positions that announced the regime's effective end. The armored task force faced desperate resistance. Iraqi forces understood that losing central Baghdad meant losing the war. Republican Guard units, Fedayeen fighters, and foreign jihadists launched suicidal attacks against American positions. Attack helicopters supporting Task Force 1-64 faced the most intense combat of the Iraq War's conventional phase. For hours, Apache and Kiowa crews flew continuous missions over Baghdad, engaging targets, suppressing enemy positions, and preventing Iraqi forces from overwhelming American ground units. Chief Warrant Officer 4 Dave Rowe, flying as Air Mission Commander for the Apache element, coordinated multiple helicopters operating simultaneously over different parts of the city. He had to manage aircraft positioning, weapons employment, coordination with ground forces, and fuel states, all while flying his own aircraft in combat. It was controlled chaos, Rowe described. You'd have 4 or 5 helicopters working different targets, ground units calling for fires, intelligence updates about enemy movements, and your own co-pilot engaging targets in your sector. You had to process information constantly while flying at low level through a city where everything could kill you. The engagement tempo was exhausting. Helicopters would fly missions lasting 2 to 3 hours, return to forward arming and refueling points, FARPs, to rearm and refuel, then launch again. Crews flew multiple missions per day, some logging 8 hours of combat flight time in 24-hour periods. During one critical engagement, an Apache flown by Chief Warrant Officers Dale Bigelow and Jeff Pyle was supporting infantry clearing buildings near the Palestine Hotel. Iraqi fighters in the hotel were firing on American positions, but the building also housed journalists and civilians, making artillery or airstrikes potentially catastrophic for public relations. Bigelow positioned his Apache to engage specific floors of the hotel with 30mm cannon fire using precision that artillery couldn't match. Pyle, operating the TADS, identified firing positions and engaged with individual rounds, suppressing enemy fire without causing the structural damage that rockets or hellfires would have created. "We were essentially providing sniper fire from a helicopter," Pyle explained. "Instead of shooting whole buildings, we were engaging individual windows where we'd identified enemy fighters. It required precision and patience, but it protected civilians while still eliminating the threat." This mission exemplified urban helicopter combat's complexity, balancing firepower with precision, military necessity with collateral damage concerns, immediate tactical needs with strategic political implications. Urban combat extracted heavy tolls on helicopters and crews. Between April 5th and 7th, nearly every Apache and Kiowa operating over Baghdad sustained battle damage. Some aircraft had minor hits, bullet holes through non-critical areas that could be patched, and the helicopter returned to service. Others required major repairs: hydraulic system replacements, rotor blade changes, avionics repairs. The maintenance burden was enormous. Aviation maintenance crews worked around the clock, repairing battle damage and conducting routine maintenance simultaneously. Some aircraft flew missions with non-critical systems inoperative because there wasn't time or parts to fix everything. Chief Warrant Officer 3, Jeff Hager, a maintenance test pilot, described the challenge. "We'd have birds coming back with 10, 15, 20 bullet holes. You'd do rapid assessment: what's critical, what's not, what can fly with damage, what needs immediate repair. Sometimes you'd patch holes with speed tape and send the aircraft back out because ground forces needed support, and that bird was the only one available." The human cost was significant, though fortunately limited given the intensity of combat. Several crew members were wounded by small arms fire or shrapnel. The armored cockpits protected pilots from most rounds, but bullets still found gaps in protection or struck areas not covered by armor. Chief Warrant Officer 2. Jason Willey took a round through his cockpit that passed between him and his co-pilot, missing both by inches. The round had come up through the aircraft floor, through the center console, and out through the canopy. Had it been 6 inches left or right, Willey or his co-pilot would have been killed. "You don't think about it at the time," Willey said. "You're focused on the mission, on staying alive, on keeping your aircraft flying. It's only afterward, when you see the bullet's path and realize how close it came, that it hits you how lucky you were." Psychological stress was intense. Crews flew knowing that any moment could bring an RPG, that mass small arms fire could bring them down, that mechanical failure at low altitude meant no options except crashing. The constant vigilance, the sustained adrenaline, the hours of combat, all created exhaustion that went beyond physical tiredness. Some pilots described it as flying while feeling like your brain was wrapped in cotton. You could function, you could fly, you could fight, but everything felt slightly disconnected, like watching yourself from outside your body. Despite the stress and danger, morale remained high. Pilots understood their missions were critical. Every time they suppressed enemy fire, every vehicle they destroyed, every position they eliminated meant American soldiers on the ground had better chances of surviving. The bond between aviation crews and ground forces was profound. Infantrymen knew that attack helicopters were their 911 force. When things went wrong, when they were pinned down, when they needed immediate fire support, helicopters would come regardless of danger, and aviators knew their mission was keeping those soldiers alive. Personal risk became secondary to mission accomplishment. You flew where you were needed, accepted the dangers, and trusted your training, your aircraft, and your crew to get you through. The fall of Baghdad in April 2003 didn't end urban helicopter combat. It transformed it. As Iraq descended into insurgency, American forces found themselves conducting counterinsurgency operations in cities throughout the country. Fallujah, Ramadi, Samarra, Najaf, Basra, urban battlefields where insurgents used civilian populations for cover and turned cities into combat zones. Attack helicopters became essential for counterinsurgency operations, providing reconnaissance, quick reaction force capabilities, and precision fires in environments where artillery and airstrikes risked excessive collateral damage. The tactics developed during Baghdad's initial combat were refined through years of continuous operations. Pilots became increasingly sophisticated in urban navigation, threat assessment, and weapons employment in densely populated areas. Night operations became standard. Using thermal imaging and night vision systems, helicopters could identify insurgents planning IEDs, track fighters moving between positions, and observe enemy activities invisible to ground forces. The precision of helicopter-delivered fires improved through experience and technology upgrades. Pilots learned to employ weapons with accuracy that minimize collateral damage while maximizing effectiveness against insurgents. During the First Battle of Fallujah in April 2004, attack helicopters provided critical support for Marine units fighting block by block through the city. The missions required the same low-altitude urban flying pioneered during Baghdad's fall, with the added complexity of distinguishing insurgents from civilians in a city where fighting occurred in residential neighborhoods. Chief Warrant Officer 3. Mike Durant, not the Black Hawk Down survivor, a different aviator with the same name, flying Apaches over Fallujah, described the moral weight of urban combat. Every shot you take has to be justified. You're not just thinking about whether you'll hit the target. You're thinking about what's behind the target, who might be in adjacent buildings, whether civilians could be affected. It's warfare with a conscience, which sounds contradictory, but that's exactly what it is. November 2004 brought the Second Battle of Fallujah, Operation Phantom Fury, the largest urban combat operation for American forces since the Vietnam War. Attack helicopters played decisive roles throughout the battle. Unlike the rapid conventional operations of April 2003, Fallujah was methodical urban warfare, Marines and soldiers clearing the city building by building, with aviation providing continuous support. The Aviation Task Organization for Fallujah included Marine Corps AH-1W Super Cobras and UH-1Y Venoms alongside Army Apaches and Kiowas. The integration of Marine and Army aviation required coordination that went beyond normal joint operations. Aircraft with different capabilities, different communication systems, and different tactical procedures, all working the same battle space. Marine Cobra pilots, flying from smaller helicopters with lighter weapons, developed techniques for navigating Fallujah's narrow streets that complemented the Army Apache's heavier firepower. The Cobras could maneuver in spaces where Apaches couldn't safely operate, while Apaches could deliver weapons effects that Cobras couldn't match. Together, they created layered support. Cobras flying low and agile, Apaches providing heavier fires from slightly higher altitudes, Kiowas conducting reconnaissance and marking targets, all coordinated to support ground forces in real time. The battle lasted 6 weeks. Aviation crews flew continuous missions, some logging mission after mission with minimal rest. The tempo was exhausting but necessary. Insurgents were fighting for every building, and ground forces needed constant aviation support. Captain Michael Irwin, an Apache pilot flying over Fallujah, described a typical engagement. Marine infantry would encounter a building with insurgents inside. They'd request aviation support. We'd get coordinates, identify the building, confirm there were no civilians visible, then engage. Sometimes it was cannon fire through windows. Sometimes it was a Hellfire missile through a specific wall. The precision required was incredible. You're delivering explosives in a city, so every shot has to be exactly right. The insurgents adapted tactics continuously. They learned to fire from covered positions, minimizing exposure to aircraft. They moved between buildings using tunnels and holes knocked through walls. They positioned themselves near mosques and hospitals, knowing American forces restricted fires near such structures. Helicopter crews adapted in turn. They developed techniques for identifying insurgents based on behavior patterns, how they moved, how they positioned weapons, how they tried to conceal themselves. Thermal imaging proved particularly valuable, showing heat signatures that revealed fighters hiding in shadows or behind walls. The battle ended with American and Iraqi forces controlling Fallujah, but at significant cost. Thousands of insurgents were killed. American forces suffered approximately 100 killed and hundreds wounded. The city was devastated, requiring years of reconstruction. Aviation's contribution was quantifiable. Hundreds of engagements, thousands of rounds expended, countless enemy fighters killed, and perhaps most importantly, American casualties prevented through timely intervention and precision fires. If Fallujah was an intense battle, Ramadi was an exhausting campaign. From 2004 through 2007, Ramadi remained contested. American forces controlled parts of the city, but insurgents held others, and fighting occurred daily. The city became the test case for counterinsurgency aviation, where helicopters operated continuously in urban environments for years rather than weeks. The missions were repetitive but never routine: patrol overwatch, convoy escort, quick reaction force for troops in contact, reconnaissance of suspected insurgent positions, precision strikes on identified targets, and casualty evacuation support. Each mission carried risks. Insurgents in Ramadi learned helicopter patterns and positioned themselves to engage aircraft. They'd fire from buildings, then disappear before helicopters could return fire. They'd use civilians as shields, making engagement decisions morally complex. Attack helicopter crews developed encyclopedic knowledge of Ramadi's geography. Pilots could navigate by landmarks, specific buildings, street intersections, distinctive features that helped orient during fast-paced operations. They learned which neighborhoods were most dangerous, which routes insurgents used, which buildings had been used for attacks. This knowledge passed from crew to crew as units rotated, created institutional memory that made operations more effective and reduced risk. Chief Warrant Officer 4. Thomas Bennett, flying over Ramadi for his third deployment, described the evolution. My first tour, we were learning the city, figuring out how to operate safely. Second tour, we knew the terrain and were refining tactics. Third tour, I could fly through Ramadi at night, low level, and know exactly where I was at any moment. The city was mapped in my brain. The Anbar awakening, beginning in late 2006, saw Sunni tribes turn against al-Qaeda in Iraq, partnering with American forces. This shift transformed Ramadi's dynamics, reducing insurgent capabilities and allowing more aggressive American operations. Attack helicopters supported the awakening by providing responsive fires when Iraqi tribal fighters encountered al-Qaeda resistance. The precision of helicopter weapons allowed engaging insurgents even when they were close to friendly Iraqi forces, something artillery or fast movers couldn't safely do. By mid-2007, Ramadi had been largely pacified through combination of military operations, political engagement, and the awakening's effects. Aviation had been essential throughout, providing the persistent presence and responsive fires that gave American and Iraqi ground forces advantages they couldn't have achieved alone. March and April 2008 brought the Battle of Sadr City, one of the Iraq War's final major urban combat operations and perhaps the most intense helicopter combat since the 2003 invasion. Sadr City, a Shiite neighborhood in eastern Baghdad, was controlled by Muqtada al-Sadr's Mahdi army. In spring 2008, the Iraqi government decided to assert control, sparking fighting between Iraqi security forces, supported by Americans, and Mahdi army militiamen. The urban warfare was intense and sustained. Mahdi army fighters, experienced from years of sporadic conflict, used Sadr City's dense construction for cover. They fired from buildings, positioned fighters on rooftops, and used civilians as shields, knowing American forces tried to minimize collateral damage. Attack helicopters operated continuously over Sadr City, providing support that artillery couldn't safely deliver in such densely populated terrain. The precision required was extreme, engaging targets in neighborhoods where every building held civilians, where schools and markets operated beside combat zones, where distinguishing combatants from civilians was nearly impossible without sustained observation. Captain Brad Holt, flying Apaches over Sadr City, described the operational challenge. You'd have militia fighters who'd set up a mortar, fire a few rounds at American positions, then disappear into buildings. We'd watch neighborhoods for hours, identifying patterns, who was moving in ways that suggested hostile intent, who was carrying weapons, who was positioning for attacks. Then when they revealed themselves by actually attacking, we'd engage immediately. The Hellfire missile proved particularly valuable in Sadr City. Its precision allowed destroying specific buildings or vehicles without causing widespread destruction. A Hellfire could penetrate a building, explode inside, and kill fighters sheltering there while leaving adjacent structures largely intact. The 30mm cannon required even more precision. Pilots would engage individual windows or roof positions, firing controlled bursts that eliminated threats without spraying entire buildings with high explosive rounds. Night operations were constant. Thermal imaging gave helicopters advantages over militia fighters who lacked night vision. Crews would identify insurgents preparing attacks under cover of darkness and engage before attacks could be executed. The battle lasted weeks. Aviation crews flew exhausting schedules, some missions lasting 4 hours or more, multiple missions per day. The mental strain was intense. Hours of focused attention, constant threat assessment, split-second engagement decisions with moral implications. The battle ended with Iraqi forces controlling Sadr City and Mahdi army standing down. Aviation's contribution had been decisive. Constant presence prevented militia from massing forces, precision fires eliminated leaders and weapons, and responsive support gave Iraqi troops confidence to operate aggressively. The Iraq War transformed attack helicopter operations fundamentally and permanently. Army aviation entered Iraq in 2003 with doctrine designed for open-terrain warfare against conventional forces. It finished the war with sophisticated urban combat capabilities developed through years of continuous operations in the world's most challenging environment. The lessons learned were codified in new training, doctrine, and procedures. Urban navigation techniques using visual references and building topology rather than just GPS. Threat assessment methodologies for distinguishing combatants from civilians in dense populations. Weapons employment procedures that maximize precision while minimizing collateral damage. Team tactics specifically designed for three-dimensional urban terrain. Communications protocols for coordinating with ground forces operating in complex environments. These lessons extended beyond Iraq. When American forces deployed to Afghanistan's cities, when they conducted urban operations worldwide, the tactics pioneered over Baghdad, Fallujah, and Ramadi provided templates. The technology evolved as well. Apache and Kiowa upgrades incorporated lessons from urban combat, improved sensors, better target identification capabilities, weapons with greater precision. The AH-64E Apache Guardian, introduced after Iraq, included improvements specifically requested by pilots who'd fought in cities. For the pilots who flew urban combat missions, the experience was transformative. They'd accomplished missions that doctrine said were impossible, survived engagements where odds favored death, and developed skills that peacetime training could never replicate. Many carried physical reminders, hearing damage from years of engine noise and weapons fire, back and neck problems from hours in cramped cockpits wearing heavy gear, scars from wounds sustained in combat. The psychological effects were significant. Post-traumatic stress affected many, manifesting as hypervigilance, sleep disturbances, difficulty transitioning to civilian life. Flying combat missions where death could come from any direction, where split-second decisions determined whether you killed enemies or civilians, left marks that didn't fade when the war ended. Chief Warrant Officer 5, Robert Mitchell, who flew multiple deployments over Iraqi cities, described the adjustment. You spend years flying where everything is a potential threat. Every rooftop, every window, every vehicle. Then you come home and you're supposed to just turn that off. But your brain doesn't work that way. You still scan rooftops. You still assess threats that don't exist. It takes time to recalibrate to a world where people aren't trying to kill you. The human cost extended beyond psychological wounds. Several aviators were killed during urban operations. Some shot down by enemy fire, others lost in accidents that occurred during high-tempo operations with minimal rest and maximum stress. Chief Warrant Officers David Williams and Ronald Young, captured after the Karbala Gap engagement in March 2003, spent 3 weeks as prisoners before being rescued by Marines. Their experience highlighted the risks aviators accepted, flying deep into enemy territory, often beyond immediate rescue capabilities, trusting that American forces would eventually reach them if they went down. For ground forces who'd been supported by attack helicopters during urban combat, the gratitude was profound and permanent. Infantry soldiers who'd been pinned down by enemy fire, who'd called for aviation support and watched Apaches or Kiowas arrive within minutes, understood that aviators had risked everything to save them. The relationship between ground forces and aviation crews became deeply personal. Many infantrymen learned the names of pilots who'd repeatedly supported their units. After returning home, they'd seek out those aviators, thank them personally, tell them how their actions had saved lives. Quantifying urban helicopter combat's impact requires examining both statistics and stories. Official records show thousands of attack helicopter missions flown over Iraqi cities between 2003 and 2011. Apaches and Kiowas logged hundreds of thousands of combat flight hours, conducted tens of thousands of weapons engagements, and provided support for virtually every significant urban operation. The weapons expenditure was staggering. Hundreds of thousands of 30mm rounds, tens of thousands of 2.75-inch rockets, thousands of Hellfire missiles, all employed in urban environments requiring precision that previous conflicts hadn't demanded. Battle damage statistics revealed the intensity. The majority of helicopters operating over Iraqi cities sustained combat damage at some point. Some aircraft were hit multiple times across different deployments. Maintenance crews became expert at repairing bullet holes, replacing damaged components, and returning aircraft to service under field conditions. But statistics alone don't capture the reality. The story of urban helicopter combat is told through individual engagements where pilots made decisions that determined whether Americans lived or died. It's told through the Apache crew that spent 4 hours orbiting over a surrounded infantry platoon, engaging enemy positions continuously until reinforcements arrived, then landing at a FARP with fuel tanks nearly empty and ammunition exhausted. It's told through the Kiowa pilot who identified an insurgent planting an IED, engaged with his .50 caliber, and prevented the device from killing Americans who would have driven past minutes later. It's told through the crews who flew missions knowing their families back home were terrified, knowing each takeoff might be their last, but launching anyway because soldiers on the ground needed them. Iraq accelerated attack helicopter technology development in ways peacetime never could have. The sensors that seemed cutting-edge in 2003 were obsolete by 2008, replaced by systems with better resolution, longer range, and enhanced target identification. The weapons that were standard early in the war were supplemented by newer variants with improved precision. Perhaps most significantly, the integration of unmanned aerial systems with attack helicopters created capabilities neither platform possessed alone. UAVs could loiter over urban areas for hours, providing persistent surveillance that helicopters conducting finite-duration missions couldn't match. But UAVs lacked the immediate response capability and weapons flexibility of manned helicopters. The combination proved powerful. UAVs would identify targets and track enemy movements, then hand off to attack helicopters when engagement was required. The helicopters would deliver precision fires, then return to station or extract while UAVs continued surveillance. This model, persistent unmanned surveillance paired with responsive manned attack platforms, became standard for urban operations and extended far beyond Iraq. Communication systems evolved dramatically. Early in the war, coordination between helicopters and ground forces was often difficult, limited by incompatible radios and insufficient bandwidth. By war's end, digital systems allowed real-time sharing of video feeds, targeting data, and situational awareness graphics. Ground forces could see what helicopter sensors saw. Pilots could receive digital target coordinates directly into their mission systems. Everyone operated from the same picture of the battle space, dramatically improving coordination and reducing fratricide risk. Training systems incorporated urban combat lessons. Flight simulators added urban terrain databases, allowing pilots to practice city navigation before deploying. Gunnery ranges developed urban target scenarios requiring discrimination between valid targets and protected structures. The Warrior Skills Trainer, a high-fidelity simulator for Apache crews, incorporated scenarios based on actual Iraqi engagements. Pilots in training would fly simulated missions over digital recreations of Fallujah, Ramadi, or Sadr City, learning urban tactics in environments that replicated combat without the lethal consequences.